In 1519, Hernan Cortés landed in modern-day Mexico. There he was met by the natives, the Aztecs, who quickly noticed that him and the rest of the conquistadors had a very strange obsession with a certain yellow metal. Now the Aztecs, they knew about gold. They made gold jewellery, they made gold statues, it was easy to work with. But they didn't use it as a form of trade, a form of exchange. It couldn't be eaten, it couldn't be drunk. You couldn't make weapons from it, it was relatively useless. So why did the conquistadors love this metal so much? When they asked Cortés, he replied, "Me and my companions have been struck with a disease of the heart that can only be cured with gold." That was an extract from Sapiens, and this is my second video on the myths that control our lives, the myths around money, religion, culture, and capitalism. Hunter-gatherer societies were largely self-sustaining and independent. They worked on a system of favours, community support, and trust, where individuals would help each other if they had skills that others didn't have, if they had abilities that others didn't have. If certain people were better at hunting, they would go out and hunt, and if other people had an eye to spot out the berries in the bush, that they would go and do that, and then at the end of the day, everybody would pool their resources together. Everybody chipped in, and it wasn't seen as something that needed to be repaid. There was no debts necessarily. It was just community, you just supported each other. And the tribes outside of that, they didn't support you, and you didn't support them. However, as humans began to live in larger and larger groups, this began to get more complex. How do you know that everyone's pulling their weight? How do you know that someone's not just freeloading off of your hard work? It also prevented specialisation. You couldn't just go and pick berries because somebody might feel like berries aren't worth the same as their meat that they had to go and kill an animal for. You couldn't just make huts and chairs because you need food as well. So everybody kind of did a little bit of everything, and nobody had a specific job or role. There was nobody who was the doctor. You'd be the hunter-gatherer that also could help you if you had a scratch in your leg. As societies grew, people began to barter. People began to specialise. If somebody was really good at growing wheat, then they would grow wheat and they would ask somebody else to protect them, or to grow them vegetables, or to rear livestock. And in this way, you could trade your wheat for somebody's chickens. You could trade chickens for somebody's lettuce or cabbage or anything like that. This was a massive advancement in how human societies organised themselves. It meant that people with certain skills, people who were better suited to certain jobs, would go and do those things. And so you got more rice, you got more vegetables, you got more meat. However, what if the person that you want to trade with doesn't want what you want? Maybe you could find a tertiary person in this system who has something you can use to barter with and wants what you have to offer. But this is not always the case, and this can make the trade a lot more complex and a lot less efficient. So money was created to solve this. It was essentially an IOU. I'm going to give you 12 eggs, and at some point you should give me something that is worth 12 eggs. And if you go and give this to somebody else, then they can come and get something that's worth 12 eggs. It became a store of value in itself. It needed to be easily transported. So if somebody was selling swords, they don't have to carry around all of these heavy swords. They can just carry around these things that are storing the value and a few swords to sell. Now, the most important thing with money, with this invention, is it has to be something that everybody wants. It's built on the belief that other people want it. So in early societies, people used things like barley, like wheat, things that everybody wanted and everybody needed because you could eat them and everybody needs to eat. So those things were easily traded. You could trade anything for that and then expect anybody else to also trade it because everybody wants it. But everybody also wants it because they know that they can trade it with everybody else. In this way, these things started to gain value, not just on their inherent value, but also the belief that other people found them valuable. The biggest leap, however, was from things like barley or salt or anything like that to useless things. Things that people can't eat, things that people can't wear or necessarily even use. One of the first of these was shekels of silver. These shekels of silver that we use, they were a lot easier to transport. They didn't spoil. You could store lots of them in a small space and didn't have to worry about rats coming and eating them. The only reason that this worked is because people believed that other people wanted it. If other people didn't want these shekels of silver, they'd be essentially worthless. There was still a problem with this though. The silver still needed to be weighed, so you knew how much there was. And also, it could be forged. People would melt down the silver and add in different metals. They would coat different things in silver to make it look like you'd had a bigger chunk of silver than you actually did. This was the beginning of forging of money, and it led to a brand new invention, again, built on belief. Coins fixed these problems in a very interesting way. So they would have the amount of silver stamped on them, so you knew exactly how much was there, you didn't need to weigh them. But they would also have the seal of a king. They were backed by a ruler, with somebody with armies, somebody that could enforce the law. And that meant that if they were forged, and you were found out to be forging them, you could be punished. If you had money and you needed to exchange it for something, you could go and take it to the king or one of the king's bankers, and they would take that because they have put their stamp on it. They have given it their literal seal of approval. So now it wasn't just built on the belief that other people wanted it. It was built on the belief that the king, the ruler, whoever was the most powerful man in the area, backed it and used it. This meant that coins like the Roman denarius were used all over the world because the backer was Rome. If Rome couldn't back their currency and made sure that forgers were persecuted, then who could? There's been denarii found all over the world, from northern Britain to India to places in northern Africa. This was used all over the world, inside and outside of the Roman Empire. Now, this belief that things have value because other people value them is very powerful. And one example of this is how different connected societies, if they have different values of objects, that they will over time equalize. Aztecs, as mentioned at the beginning of this video, they didn't value gold. It was a worthless metal. You couldn't do anything with it. But once the conquistadors arrived, who did want gold, it suddenly became valuable. People suddenly started realizing, we can give this to conquistadors. And then they started realizing that we could give this to other Aztecs, who will give this to the Spaniards. And eventually it was just, people want this. People from all over want this, and this is a valuable thing. It's crazy to think how the belief in these objects, the belief in the power of a ruler, the belief in collective value can give value and can make things important, can have people die for things, have people live for things that don't actually do anything for their lives, that they can't eat, that they can't drink, that they can't wear. And I think this is a big factor in some of the problems that we have in modern society and societies in the past, is that the trust that we used to have in each other, in community, in I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, has now been handed to these notes, to these coins, to these numbers in bank accounts, and that adds a certain cynicism to the world. Now, nations are funded by money, but they're held together by culture. Culture is the imaginary ties that bind a nation. They give you a sense of belonging, of a fraternity with the people that live hundreds of miles away, but share a common language and a common identity. But this too is a myth. To demonstrate this, I'll tell you a story about the Numantians. The Numantians lived in modern day Spain, and they were fierce fighters, and they valued freedom over all. They sent legion after legion that the Romans sent at them, fleeing in retreat. And while the Romans were conquering all of the world, they held strong for many years. One day, the Romans sent their best general to go and fight them. And instead of fighting them head on, he blockaded their city, and they starved to death. Many of these taking their own lives so as to not become slaves. And now, in modern day Spain, the plight of the Numantians is heralded as a symbol of Spanish independence and defiance. They have paintings, books, tragedies written about these people. They have poems. The city itself is a national monument site, and they have comic books written about the heroic Numantians. And yet, these poems and these stories are written in Spanish, which is a Romance language. It's just Latin from the Romans. Many of these people are Catholic, many Spaniards are Catholic, and that is a Roman institution. Much of the Spanish culture comes from Rome, comes from those Latin roots, as for the rest of Europe, as in Britain and France and everywhere else where the Romans conquered, they left their culture. And this just highlights how culture isn't about where you come from. It isn't about the place that you grew up or the area that you associate with. It's something that is passed down. It's something that you believe about yourself, but isn't necessarily true. It isn't necessarily to do with where you come from or who your family is. Now, in the modern day, we have lots of nation states. Nation, an entire country, is a single homogenous culture. So England has English people, France has French people, and there are obviously subgroups. And the United Kingdom has Scots and Welsh people and Irish people. Spain, they have the Catalans and the Basque region, and there's lots of these different places. But on the whole, there is one dominant culture in each of these countries. There's a language, there's a type of food. You can think of all these, especially around Europe, very distinct cultures from country to country. Now, what separates these nation states from an empire is that an empire rules over lots of different types of people, lots of different cultures. The Incan Empire was an empire because they ruled over lots of different cultures, lots of different tribes and peoples with their own languages and their own custom. Now, in prehistory, emperors and rulers had a very us versus them mentality. If you subjugated another town or its people, they became your subordinates. You ruled over them and they weren't really part of your empire. You were the king of X peoples, and Y and Z, they were their own peoples, and you just ruled them. They weren't your subjects, they weren't the king of them. And then this started to change with certain emperors who started to think that they were the rulers of all people, that they had a superior culture and a superior way of doing things, and that they wanted to bring this to the masses, to everybody. And every town that they invaded, every place that they took over became a part of their empire. Those people became their subjects. They weren't the king of X, they were the king of XYZ and everything else. And empires like to spread culture. Emperors and the empire themselves naturally spread culture. Firstly, because it's easier to control a homogenized group. They have standards for measurement, unified language. They have standards in law, in language, in cultural customs. There's no internal division between people who think it should be done this way and this way, or not as much as it is if there's lots of different cultures and lots of different beliefs and ideologies and ways of seeing the world. And because of this, empires will, over time, homogenize. You can see this across Europe, whereas there would have been very distinct languages and cultures, more and more similar. Germanic languages are very similar to English languages. The French, Spanish and Italian languages are all very similar because of Latin, because they're all Romance languages. But the second reason that empires like to spread culture is, as I mentioned before, it allows them to have this myth that they are spreading superior culture, that they are giving civilization to the barbarians, that what they're doing, all of the killing and the pillaging, is actually for a good cause. It's actually a good thing that they're killing these people. These people need to be ruled because they are uncivilized and they don't know the right way to do things, and that the culture that this emperor brings is going to save them, is going to be their salvation somehow. And you can see this throughout history. The Romans felt like this about the barbarians that they were taking over across Europe. Britain went across the world, and other European empires went across the world. They spread Christianity and the salvation that they thought they were giving these people their God. This causes empires to follow a very cyclical pattern. You can see this throughout history, from the Romans to the Persians to the British Empire, is that a single group becomes powerful and they start taking over other groups, forming an empire. Then their culture is imposed upon these people as the right way to do things, as the superior way, as the civilized way. And then over time, these cultural traditions and language and laws are adopted by the local people, and they start to adopt that culture as their own. Even though they're from this place, they adopt the culture of another place because of the rulers. And then their children and their grandchildren start to see themselves as a part of that empire, as a citizen of that empire, and start to identify with that culture. So then they start to demand equal rights. They want to have the same privileges as their rulers, and treated the same under the law. Now, the rulers generally don't like this and usually fight back, but at this point, it's already done. They adopted the culture. They are essentially the same. The only thing that's separating them now is the location. And usually what will happen is these peoples will enter the positions of power, and the culture will evolve and change until it goes and spreads somewhere else. And these cultures that are spread through empire, through conquest, but also through community and interaction, they can be a really powerful force. They can get people to die for a certain cause. As we saw at the start of the 20th century, nationalism, the idea that there's one group of people under this culture, or a sort of ethnic grouping, I suppose, is very powerful. It's a very powerful rallying point, and it's something that is gaining in prevalence today. But ultimately, it is a myth. It's not real. If you put that person at the start of their life somewhere else, they'd be completely different. And so, just like money, it is just a tool. It's just a myth, a collective imagination that we use to help organize ourselves. Another great unifier, another great tool of control is religion. People of all creeds, races, and backgrounds can congregate around a religion. Someone from a completely different culture, a completely different part of the world, can identify with you if you two believe in the same God. Going back to prehistory, thousands of years ago, first religions were described as animist. They were local and they were exclusive. They were very personal to the world that the people lived in. You'd worship certain animals, you'd worship certain rocks and trees and rivers, and it was very much an even playing field. They weren't necessarily seen as all-powerful beings. It was a connection with the world that these people lived in. It was seeing these objects, these trees, these rivers, these animals as equals, and trying to communicate with them and ask them for good fortune. After the agricultural revolution, when humans started farming, there was a shift in how humans perceived themselves in the hierarchy of the world. No longer were they just a single species in a world full of species, full of animals and plants and rocks. They were the master. They were the ones controlling. They were the ones putting animals in pens and deciding where things should grow and how forests and gardens should develop. We started to see ourselves as better than these things, and we stopped praying to them, we stopped worshipping them, and instead we started to worship a plethora of different human-like gods. Polytheism was inherently open-minded. A lot of these cultures did believe in a sort of one god, a sort of underlying force of nature. So for the Greeks, it was fate. For the Hindus, it was Atman, sort of the way of the universe. But that all-governing power was seen as uninterested in human affairs. It was seen as unbiased. It couldn't be swayed. It saw everything. And so your troubles were important to it. And so these people would pray to individual aspects of this one god. Therefore, when these empires spread, they would incorporate different gods into their own pantheon. You probably know that a lot of the Roman gods are actually Greek, but there were also Celtic gods in the Roman pantheon, and each town and area would worship a different god for different reasons. You know, Athens would worship Athena and so on. Now, in the book, this is something that I didn't know, but apparently Christians were actually persecuted not because they didn't believe in the right gods or they were heretics, but because they would refuse to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor. So in the Roman Empire, the emperor was seen as one of these gods in this pantheon, and you could believe whichever ones you want as long as you acknowledge that he was one of them. And the Christians obviously wouldn't. They believed in the one God. They believed in the God, capital G God. However, monotheism had one major advantage over polytheism, and that's the fact that it's inherently more closed-minded. which sounds counterintuitive at first, but when you think that a polytheist isn't necessarily going to try and force somebody else to believe their religion. They don't think that they're right. They believe in their gods and you believe in yours, and they're all aspects of this one other god. But with what monotheism, you were right. You believed in the right god and everybody else believed in the wrong gods and were heretics and needed to have their minds changed in order to reach salvation. And so it was a good thing, a prosperous thing, a righteous thing to try and help these people and to try and get them to believe in your God. Now, despite this closed-mindedness, it actually incorporates a lot of aspects of polytheism and dualism. Dualism being the belief that there are two main gods or two main forces in the universe. Usually it's a good one and a bad one. So in Zoroastrianism and Gnosticism, there's a good god that made the spirit and a bad god that made the physical form. And this is represented in monotheism with the devil, or polytheism with all the angels and all of the saints. And these religions are collective beliefs, whether they're real or not. They're things that hundreds of thousands, millions of people around the world believe, that give them rules and structures and a common framework to work together. Whereas without that, they would have no frame of reference to communicate with each other. In Sapiens, Harari defines a religion as something that gives you a framework, as a set of rules to follow that has a superhuman cause. Not supernatural, not superpowers, but a cause that is not created by humans, that is sort of a natural law. So, laws of physics, the law of gravity, E equals mc squared, those things are all superhuman. The things that we haven't created that are just natural laws, but they don't give you an ideology or a framework to follow. Football gives you rules and a framework to follow, but that was something created by humans. So an ideology or religion is something that sits in the middle. So it doesn't need a god. So Buddhism is a valid religion. But by this definition, things like capitalism, liberalism, all of these things are also religions. They are marketed as superhuman, things that are just natural states that humans will follow, not created by man, and yet they give us rules to follow. So all of these ideologies and religions, they are collective beliefs. They are things that we all believe in, that give us structure to our lives, that similarities and identity between us and people halfway across the world. They tell us how to lead our lives and how to conduct ourselves. And yet, in the modern day, capitalism is the dominant ideology, is the dominant belief that rules all of our lives. As previously mentioned, money is essential for building empires, for scientific research, and for business. And yet there was another breakthrough, again, built on belief, that allowed money to elevate society to the next level. This was initiated by banks. Banks lend money that they don't have to businesses that they believe will do well, and this grows the economy. So a very simple example of this is, let's say a builder puts £1 million into a bank, and then a baker wants to build a bakery, but he doesn't have the money. He wouldn't usually be able to go and build a bakery by himself. He'd have to make loads and loads of money and save it up for years and years. So instead he goes to a bank and asks for a loan. Now the bank has this £1 million, and so they can give the baker £1 million loan. But the bank don't actually own that money. That money is owned by the contractor. The bank are just holding it for him. But the belief is that that money will be used to create a profitable business, and then from that they will be able to repay their loan with interest and make more money. And the belief is that they will get their return with interest before the builder comes to collect. And maybe the bakery is built by the builder and they get paid that £1 million, and then they can deposit that £1 million into the bank. Now there's £2 million in the bank, but that £1 million has just circulated the economy twice. And so through this sort of repeating cycle, the banks generate wealth in the economy. And now we've been talking a lot about beliefs, but one major belief that changed the whole system is the belief in growth, which is essentially what capitalism is. It's the belief things will continue to grow forever. And this had a major impact on the world, bigger than you'd think, because before this time, if you were rich, you either inherited it or you stole it. The pie got bigger, so if you got a bigger slice of the pie, you were cutting through somebody else's. That's why religions and ancient cultures really valued frugality and being humble. And so loans did exist. They have existed for thousands of years, but these would tend to be small. They tended to have extremely extortionate high interest, and they tended to be for very small amounts of money. Nobody wanted to lend millions and millions of denarii to somebody for 1% over 30 years. It's just not something that would happen, because they didn't believe that that person would be able to make the money back. They didn't believe that there were any things out there that money could generate returns on. As science advanced in the Enlightenment, technology started to get better and the economy started to grow. People started to get returns on their money, and so people started to lend out money for lower interest rates, larger amounts of money for longer terms. And this funded expeditions, this funded experiments and innovation, which led to further growth and further returns on the money being invested, which again lowered interest rates. And this created a cycle which allowed for very cheap and easy loans and money. This led to Adam Smith writing The Wealth of Nations, which is a book about capitalism, about the invisible hand of the market and how capital is actually a good thing. This was a real shift in how people thought. As I mentioned, people believed that wealth was bad, that if you were rich, you must have stolen it or inherited it. And he changed this belief. He started to say, no, wealth is bad, but capital is good. If you have a lot of money, if you have a lot of capital, you can invest that. If you were a business owner, you could hire more workers, which means that there's more people to buy your products so that you can get even more money and start paying your workers more, so that they can buy more stuff. In this way, your slice of the pie growing makes my slice of the pie grow, and vice versa. I get richer, we all get richer. If you get richer, we all get richer. Capital being invested increases production and helps everybody. This is also true for governments. If they invest more into the economy, then the economy grows. There's more infrastructure, businesses grow, and then they can get more tax revenue, and so that they can invest that back into the economy. Now, this chapter of the book really gives validity to the idea of trickle-down economics, that if you make the rich richer, that everybody will prosper, that everybody will start to gain the benefits of that. And this is an idea I'm going to be looking into in the next series, which is on the invisible doctrine. So if you're interested in that, go into my channel and check that out after this video. And once this capitalist system really started to get going, it actually paved the way for imperialism. So Columbus was traveling around Europe looking for somebody to give him a loan. He asked Portugal and the lords in Italy, and nobody wanted to give him a loan to go and travel to the Americas. Why? What's over there? We don't know. I might not get my money back. He might die on the way over there. But the King of Spain gave him a chance and gave him a loan. And this paid off massively. He discovered a whole new continent, and on that continent, gold. Lots of gold. There was gold mines popping up everywhere and silver mines. And this made Spain very, very rich and catapulted them into the global superpower that they became. They used this money to invest in more expeditions, to control more land, to take over more gold mines and more silver mines. And this gave them so much power and wealth that this capitalist growth loop just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And in this vast empire that they controlled was Holland, was the Netherlands in Northern Europe. And yet, despite this, they revolted. And Spain had the money, they had the people, they had the power and the technology. And yet Holland actually beat Spain. This was because at the time the king spent very frivolously and the courts obeyed him. The Dutch, however, had very low interest rates. They were seen as very reliable people to lend money to, whereas the king, not so much. They had a rule of law that obeyed all people Their nobility was liable under the law, so if they didn't pay somebody back or if they scammed somebody, they would be dealt with. And so this gave confidence to the banks, this gave confidence to investors that they could invest in the Dutch, and because of this they were able to hire mercenaries and a whole navy which they used to fend off the Spanish. And then they used this navy and all of this economic dominance to go and take over vast parts of East Asia. Private companies financed through the Dutch economic system hired mercenaries and travelled the world creating trade outposts, and these trade outposts then lowered tariffs and made trading easier, which increased productivity and increased growth in the Netherlands. The book gives an example of two sons who are given a large amount of money by their father and sent off. One goes to Spain and one goes to Amsterdam. So the son in Spain gives a large loan to the king to go fight a war. It's a pretty safe bet. The king has lots of money. He's likely to win. He's the most powerful man in the world, and he will likely repay. The other invests his money into the stock market in Amsterdam. Now, a couple of years later, they're both trying to collect their money, and the guy in Amsterdam, he gets his investment back. It's a very safe investment. He didn't have as high of a return as the guy in Spain. But when the guy in Spain goes to ask for his money from the king says, no, I'm fighting another war now on the other side of the empire, and I'm actually going to need an extra loan from you, and if you don't obey, you're going to get your head cut off. So the son asks his father, please, can I have some more money? And this time he'll pay it back, I promise. And the guy in Amsterdam just reinvests the money. Then another couple of years go by, and the guy in Amsterdam actually gets frauded. The money that he was meant to get back from the loan, he didn't. The guy didn't make any money. Same thing happens in Spain. The king says, no, I'm not going to pay you. I don't have the money. I'm bankrupt from all of these wars that I've just fought. So they both go to the courts and they both try and appeal. And the guy in Spain, he gets killed. But the guy in Amsterdam has his court case approved and gets the money back. This is why the Dutch were able to take over vast parts of Asia and create this massive dominant global empire. But eventually they fell into frivolity and started spending a lot of money. So after they started to decline, it was between Britain and France. These were the two emerging superpowers. France had the bigger empire. They had more money. They had a bigger army. The king spent a lot of money. He would spend on things he didn't need. He would invest in things that failed. And so the market started to increase his interest rates slowly and slowly until it was actually very expensive for him to take loans and to raise capital when he needed it. Britain, on the other hand, had very, very low interest rates. So people started to invest there. People started to put their money there because it was safer. It couldn't be taken by the king. And so eventually, when war broke out, Britain was able to raise lots and lots of capital to pay for mercenaries and to pay for weapons, whereas France was not able to, and so Britain became the dominant superpower. So this belief that things are going to grow, that investment is important and that it is the dominant force in our world, it's enforced by the government, and it always has been. In the 19th century, many British companies sold opium to China. And so China banned opium as it was starting to become an epidemic. It was starting to decrease their productivity and kill their people. British companies didn't care, and they continued to sell the opium to China, and so they started to seize it at the ports. Now, this impacted the money. This impacted the bottom line for these businesses, and so the government stepped in and went to war with China. Their conditions were that they open the ports and allow these companies to continue exporting opium to them. And the book mentions quite a few examples of things like this happening, of countries being invaded because the business's growth was being put at risk. When Egypt had a large debt to the London Stock Exchange, and they had a revolution where the revolutionaries said they weren't going to pay that debt, the British government stepped in and invaded. When the Greek rebels in the Ottoman Empire funded their war with bonds set up in the London Stock Exchange and started to look like they were going to lose, the British stepped in and destroyed much of the Ottoman navy to allow the Greeks a second chance. This shows how this belief in growth and belief that The companies in a country and their growth and their prosperity is prosperity for all is so dominant in our society that the government will step in. The government has essentially become a union for capitalism. And now it has become the dominant shared myth around the world. Almost every country in the world is capitalist by nature, and it has taken over the place that religion once held in controlling how people conduct their lives. Money, capitalism, and culture are the three lies that we tell ourselves that control every aspect of our lives. The belief in growth, the belief that money is real, and the belief that we have a shared identity with people that we've never met halfway across countries in the world. But has all of this actually made us happy? Has all of this growth and progress that these things have brought, the globalism, the increase in urban cities, has this all actually made us happier? Has this all actually been a net positive on us, on the planet, on animals, on our welfare? Well, that is what the final video in this series is going to be discussing.